I'd like to see that happen, but again, you change with this proposed legislation, you change the process, one person, one agency, without giving them more resources. So really, you're giving small businesses the ability, the right, but they won't be able to exercise it. I'd love to support it, but I'm just going to have to say no on this one.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Yes,
Mr. Correa?
yes.
I did want to, just as a quick question, as I'm looking through here, regarding the focus on small businesses and entities. Is small defined here according to SBA, Department of Commerce? How is it defined? And does it take into account the variations among different industries that could come under this jurisdiction?
In answer to your question, I believe it's defined under the original act. Under the original 1980 act.
I'm sorry, where are you?
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. And I want to engage in a colloquy with some of the proponents of the legislation. I think the goals are laudable to try to reduce the impact of agency and regulatory action on small businesses. But I am concerned because I envision a world in January of 2025 when Donald Trump is the president again and is issuing executive orders and proceeding for more wall construction on the southern border. And this bill, if it were law, could potentially bite those efforts like a border rattlesnake, I fear. And so maybe the proponents can dissuade my concerns, but is there a world in which the well-intentioned and good-meaning provisions of this bill could impair executive action on border security? I'll yield to Ms. Hagan. Or Mr. Moran.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, could
Sure.
you repeat that?
Yeah, I want to give you the opportunity to dissuade my concerns that the provisions of this act could be utilized by a small business or a nonprofit to impair executive action on border security.
No, because we're not talking about executive action. We're talking about regulatory burdens from the administrative state on businesses. And frankly, if we're going back to the original intent of the 1980 Regulatory Flexibility Act, which was the act I was referencing for you just a second ago to the gentleman from Maryland, what we're talking about is, are we going to force our government to slow the regulatory process down or not?
Yeah, but the question is whether or not someone could slow down, not the regulatory process, but could slow down a regulation that is there to facilitate additional construction of a border wall. For example, if President Trump were to have to issue executive orders, if DHS were to have to engage in eminent domain, or some other regulatory act in concert with Texas or someone else, like, is there a world in which some nonprofit or small business could send the Trump administration off on some prove-it wild goose chase while people are coming across our border? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, if the gentleman is asking if a bill that's passed by Congress can be misused or misinterpreted to thwart good activities, I would say that's always a possibility. And certainly we do not intend this bill to be overly broad, but we need to provide a pause and a regulatory slowdown that affects small businesses. So the intent is not to do that, certainly not. Can we conceive of hypotheticals when that might happen? Well, I suspect we can conceive of many hypotheticals, but the reality is this is going to preserve businesses' ability to grow without the administrative state bringing down its heavy hammer on it.
And if I may engage
Certainly.
as well.
Certainly.
What this is a good government bill, and it's about accountability and transparency. And all it does is requires the regulatory agencies to actually disclose the cost of their regulations upon small businesses. So again, using the ear tag example, the agency is attempting to minimize how much they say this is going to cost because they want to avoid having to do a more detailed analysis on of what the real cost to the regulated community, our cattle and bison producers, would be. In the case of building the wall, it is so long as the agency is actually disclosing the costs, then this doesn't necessarily even come into play. So it is a good governance bill requiring our agencies to be honest about the cost of the regulations that they are issuing.
It would make me feel better if the gentlelady could just tell me that you can't envision a circumstance in which the provisions of this bill could be used to delay or otherwise impair those executive actions on border security. Is that true?
I am not foreseeing
Okay.
what those would be.
Great. I'm going to take my final moments to a point of personal privilege to recognize the esteemed former chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Smith of Texas. Thanks for being here and honoring us with your presence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Who further seeks recognition? Ms. Van Drew, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Real briefly, I mean, facts are a good thing. So the facts are that the cost of compliance for small business has grown very significantly. The fact is in 2001, it cost nearly as much as double what medium-sized businesses spent per employee to comply with federal regulations. By 2014, that number went up to 5 times as much as what a medium-sized business does. And today, small businesses spend over 7 times as much per employee as medium-sized businesses do for compliance. And the SBA reported, in one report, 75% of rulemakings, the SBA, a government agency, determined that federal agencies either ignored costs on small business or completely underestimated them. The Biden administration has even increased these costs more. The average annual cost of regulation is estimated to be, in a small business now, $14,000 per employee. It's a lot of money, and it's hard on small business. Entrepreneurship starts with small business. Entrepreneurship and small business, I state the obvious, is what built this great country. This bill goes in the right direction. I believe it's a good thing, and I will be supporting it. And I really mean it on this one. I would hope there'd be bipartisan support. I mean, if there's a little tiny bit more to be done, that's great. Want me to yield? I yield to Ms. Hagman.
One other statistic that I think is important is that on average, agencies underestimate the cost of their regulations by 40%. So to the extent that any agency identifies a regulation as being significant, meaning it will have an economic impact of over $100 million, you can assume that the actual economic impact of that regulation is $140 million. All we're attempting to do with this regulation is force the agencies to be more accurate in their calculations of the impact on our small businesses. I also would hope that we would have bipartisan support for this. Again, it's a good governance and transparency bill that I think is in the best interest of our small businesses across this country. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman yields back. For what purposes does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 7198.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves point of order.
Offered by Mr. Nadler of New York.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I won't take 5 minutes. It's very simple. My amendment would strike the provision requiring analysis of indirect costs as part of the periodic review required under this bill. As I noted in my opening statement, this legislation would stall the work of government by requiring the periodic review of rules that have long been law, to analyze any, quote, indirect costs that may have arisen in the past decade since the rule was promulgated. Indirect costs are extremely hard to measure and can be highly misleading. Moreover, agencies need far more resources to do their job if we are going to impose this extra burden on them. We should not be bogging down our already under-resourced agencies with nearly impossible tasks. And that's why my amendment would strike the provision requiring analysis of indirect costs as part of the periodic review. I ask my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman from Arizona withdraw his point of order? Point of order is withdrawn. I'll recognize myself in opposition to the amendment to just suggest that It's the periodic review that is necessary to clean out a lot of the dead wood in the regulatory code. And while my concerns were with some of the proactive natures, going through some of the costs that small businesses have been burdened with for year after year, decade after decade, seem to be the most laudable provisions of the bill. And I'll yield to the gentlelady from Wyoming with any thoughts she may have in opposition.
And in fact, in defining indirect costs is the way that defining costs as indirect is one of the ways in which the agencies hide what an actual cost of a regulation will be. And I will again use the example of the RFID requirement. The radio frequency identification is a button or an ear tag placed in the ear of either the cattle or the bison that are being herded. But all of that button or that ear tag is absolutely irrelevant and does nothing unless you have all of the related equipment to be able to read that ear tag. So you're going to have the wand, you're going to have the computer equipment, you're going to have the software, you're going to have to be able to be handling the cattle and bison to actually put the ear tag on. So all of those costs are identified as indirect costs because they're not the actual RFID, but they absolutely are a cost associated with that regulation. It is getting at the indirect cost that is so important, and it's why the Prove It Act, again, is a good governance bill based upon transparency and accountability, because it is forcing the agencies to actually disclose to the American public the real cost of their regulations on small businesses. In light of the importance of small businesses to the economic powerhouse that the United States is, I would think everyone would want to know what the cost of these regulations are. With that, I yield. I'll yield to Mr. Moran.
I'll yield to the gentleman from Texas. Recognize.
Thank you, Mr.